Hello and welcome to our next set of programs. I am so thrilled to be here. I am in the home of Susan Dossetter. The last time that we enjoyed her programs on the doll houses was at the Summer Fling event, and now we are back to learn some more stories and some wonderful history of some of her favorite items in her collection that feature wooden dolls. We hope that you enjoy them so very much.
Hello everyone, and so glad to be with you again and to be sharing some fabulous things from my collection. The last time I presented to you 4 early dolls houses, and they were early English dolls houses, and they were filled with all sorts of wonderful furniture and objects and all kinds of things, and they were peopled with little early wooden dolls. Well, today I'm going to share with you some of my larger early wooden dolls. I mentioned in my last presentations that, and I say this all the time, I love my collection and the dolls and all the things in it for their beauty and their craftsmanship and their charm. But the thing that excites me the most is their connection to history and learning history through the items themselves. I showed you some examples of this during the Dolls House presentations, but today I'm going to show you how I have learned history through dolls. This first doll I'm going to share with you could not be a more perfect example. He is an early English wooden doll. He is about 18 inches tall, and he is very, very special and rare. He is rare for many reasons. First of all, any early English wooden doll is rare. You can imagine with fires, floods, being tossed out, not considered important, very few survive today, and also very few were made. So he's rare in that sense. Secondly, he's rare because he is a male. Now, male dolls are much, much more rare than female dolls, even with the later bisque and porcelain. But that is 1,000-fold even more so with the early English wooden dolls. I think I maybe have one male early English wooden doll for every 10 or 12 females. They're just, a good man is hard to find. You know that he is verifiably, authentically, and was a male and was crafted to be a male because he has a flat chest. You can't tell because of his long hair, because you could think he's a female because of his long hair, but men, of course, in those days, in the 18th century, it was quite the fashion to have long hair that was either in a ponytail or a plait, a braid, and they would do with their natural hair as well as with wigs. So he's special also because he's a male. Third of all, he is special because he has blue eyes. Some people mistakenly think that only the later early English wooden dolls of the Georgian period have blue eyes, as opposed to the more common black eyes, but that's actually not true. This doll dates from the mid to the 3rd quarter of the 18th century, and I also have another doll of the same period who has also blue eyes. So blue eyes were very rare, but they were done, even in the relatively early parts of the 18th century. Also, he is very special because he is in 100% all original condition. And I wanted to just segue a bit to talk a little bit about that. So I remember I used to go to doll shows and auctions, and I would see a lot of my friends and collectors looking at the dolls on the various tables with these little lights. And I was like, what are they doing? And then I found out they were using black lights to try to weed out or discern new paint versus the original old paint. Now that is not at all what's required with an early English wooden doll. They oftentimes have to be touched up and restored in order to preserve them. So that's where we come to restoration versus preservation. So when restoration is necessary in order to preserve a doll, then it is absolutely acceptable with an early English wooden doll. The way these dolls were made was they first started with a hardwood, such as sycamore or birch. They were covered with, once they were turned and carved, they were covered with several layers of gesso. Then they were painted, and then they were covered with a thick layer of varnish or enamel over the painting. Now, what could happen over the 250, 300 years of their existence is if a crack happens and then they're in different climates, such as warm and cold, or different humidity, hot and dry and moist and cold, whatever, if moisture gets into those cracks, it can actually cause the paint and all three layers, the gesso, the paint, and the enamel, to just lift. Two of the most famous early English wooden dolls in history, Lord and Lady Clapham, who reside in the V&A Museum in London, they actually had quite a bit of preservation done to their faces, and it was necessary to preserve them for the next 300 or more years. I remember once a dealer who handled a collection of very good early wooden dolls from a now long since gone collector told me that it was a real shame because several of the dolls' faces, he said, just almost exploded. Part of that was because they had been kept in airtight situations. Very, very important that early dolls are kept in areas where they have air circulating. Now you can put them in your doll cabinets, but make sure that there's either a little opening or that there's cracks or that maybe open the doors a tiny bit every once in a while. Do not keep them in an airtight situation such as a dome or a case that's airtight. That's very bad for the finish and even the fabrics too. Very, very bad. So anyway, these dolls often need some touch up here and there. And that's okay as long as the restoration is sensibly and carefully and appropriately done. And then I consider it preservation, but only do the very, very minimal, because if restoration is overly done, then it just destroys, to me, what is the heart and soul of the doll. And you should know better because of Antiques Roadshow. Do the very minimum. So he's very rare in that he has totally untouched, perfect original condition. He also has original clothing. Again, I've said so many times, original clothing is so special and valuable and key, again, to the essence and the soul of the doll. And I would rather have a doll in no clothing at all or in undergarments than to have newly made clothing. Even if it's well done and even if it's made with age-appropriate fabric, I can spot a reproduction dress or outfit a mile away. So this young man has 100% all original and quite elaborate clothing. But the most important and special thing about this jaunty gentleman is his history. He was dressed to be Bonnie Prince Charlie. Now, before I owned this doll, I knew a little bit about Bonnie Prince Charlie and Jacobite history. But what I learned through owning this doll and studying him and researching the parts and pieces of this doll was just fantastic. And I'd like to share all that with you. So first of all, I need to do a very, very quick synopsis of how this came to be, this whole Jacobite period in history. So, England was a Catholic country for thousands of years. England was first introduced to Catholicism at the end of the 6th century. So for thousands of years, England was a Catholic country until King Henry VIII came to the throne. What happened? He married his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She had formerly been married to King Henry's brother, Prince Arthur. They were married in 1501. The marriage lasted only 5 months because Arthur died. So Catherine of Aragon was a widow. Henry ended up marrying Catherine in 1509 at the age of 17. They were married for 22 years. They only produced one child, an heir. Her name was Mary. So Henry started getting a little bit antsy about not having a male heir, but then something else happened. In walks Anne Boleyn. She was in the court. She was one of the leading ladies in waiting to Queen Catherine. And she was very, very beautiful and flirtatious, and Henry fell madly in love with her. He was absolutely besotted. He desperately wanted to marry her, and he couldn't because, as you know, Catholicism does not allow divorce. So what did he do? In the year 1532, Henry took the huge move of breaking from Rome and establishing the Protestant Church of England. And that would change the course of history forever. So you may know what ended up happening to Anne Boleyn. I don't need to go into that. But and he had many other wives, as you know. But that's how we got to this place. So when Henry died, his one and only heir at the time was Mary. He'd had Elizabeth with Catherine, but the next in line, with Anne, but the next in line was Mary. She earned the infamous nickname Bloody Mary, you know, like the drink that you have on Sunday brunch, because Catherine of Aragon, her mother, was a devout Catholic, and Mary was raised to be a devout Catholic. So here we'd had Catholicism, then Henry VIII started the Church of England, which was Protestant, and then when he died, Mary, who became queen, decided she wanted the country to be Catholic again. She was absolutely ferocious in her intensity. She earned the name Bloody Mary because she burned at the stake literally hundreds and hundreds of people, anyone who she deemed a heretic, which just meant that you didn't believe in Catholicism. So she was a very, very tyrannical ruler for sure. She reigned from 1553 to 1558. And then when she died, the next in line was Henry's daughter Elizabeth, who he'd had with Anne Boleyn. Now Elizabeth had been raised Protestant, so it flipped back again to Protestantism. And then when she reigned for 45 years until 1603, and that was actually a very dangerous time to be a Catholic. And many, many, many hundreds of years later, up through the end of the 17th century, it was dangerous to be a Catholic in England. So there had been this flip-flopping of religions, and it was very, very difficult times indeed. The following rulers, James I was a Protestant. He came after Elizabeth. Then Charles I was a Protestant, but he had a Catholic wife, so Parliament got a little bit antsy there. And then there was Oliver and Richard Cromwell, also Protestant. And then Charles II. He was Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism right before his death. Okay, so it was a little bit tenuous there. And then when he died, who was next in line for the throne? James II, who was a devout Catholic. Well, he ruled only 3 years, from 1685 to 1688, at which time something happened called the Glorious Revolution. Parliament no longer wanted a Catholic ruler, and they basically dethroned him, deposed him, and he fled for his life to the safety of France, which was a Catholic country, and his cousin, King Louis XIV, who protected him. So that was then how England again regained its Protestantism. So Parliament brought instead to reign William and Mary. William was Dutch. He was called William of Orange, and Mary, believe it or not, was James II's actual daughter. So that must have been very insulting. They ruled, they were between 1689 and 1694. William continued to rule after Mary's death in 1702. And there actually was something called the Act of Settlement passed in 1701 by Parliament. The Act of Settlement said that there could no longer ever again be a Catholic monarch in England. And believe it or not, that law was only repealed in 2011. Pretty crazy, huh? All right, so we have James III. He was known as the Old Pretender. He was the son of James II, and he was born in France, and he led in 1715 what was known as the First Jacobite Rebellion. The term Jacobite came from his name, James. The Latin version of James is Jacobus. So that's where the term Jacobite came from. And the Jacobites were people that were loyal to the Stewart line, meaning King James, and they very, very desperately wanted the Stewart line to be restored to the throne and for there to be a Catholic monarch on the throne again. Many, many people from Scotland and Ireland, as well as some English people, but mostly from Scotland and Ireland, allied with James III and were the Jacobites. He led, as I said, the First Jacobite Rebellion in 1715. It was a dismal failure. They were severely outnumbered by the Redcoats, and it failed miserably. But then, Bonnie Prince Charlie. His name was Charles Edward Stewart. He was born in 1720. He was born in Rome. That's where his father was living at the time. And he was known as the Young Pretender. His father was known as the Old Pretender because He felt that he was the rightful king, but people that were against him called him a pretend king. So that's where the word old pretender comes from. His son, Charles Edward Stewart, was known as the young pretender. He became just the stuff of legends. He was called Bonnie Prince Charlie because he was quite a bonny boy. He had very light blonde hair. He had pale, light hazily blue eyes, and he was tall and slender, and he just became the symbol for the Jacobites and their hopes and dreams of restoring a Stuart monarch and Catholicism to the throne. He led the Second Jacobite Rebellion, in which went from 1745 through to 1746. In the beginning, the rebellion was actually quite successful, believe it or not. Although they were severely outnumbered by the Redcoats, they actually had a very significant victory very early on in 1745, where they they besieged the castle of Carlisle in Scotland and made it their fort. Then there was the Battle of Prestonpans and Falkirk, both of which they were successful at. But then came the Battle of Culloden. The Battle of Culloden took place on April 16, 1746. It was a nightmare. You had, Highlanders, farm boys, all kinds of people loyal to Bonnie Prince Charlie, literally fighting with just anything they could find, farm tools, whatever swords they had, the few knives, and they were up against the Redcoats with their muskets, their many guns, and their cannons. It was a cold, wet day. The moor was marshy and muddy, and it was just a disaster and a bloodbath. Between 1,500 and 2,000 Jacobite men were killed on Culloden Moor that day, and many more in the aftermath. A man named the Duke of Cumberland, who had led the Redcoats in this battle, went absolutely crazy with revenge, and for many, many weeks or even months after the battle was over, he went from village to village. He set fire, he killed livestock, he killed any human, males he found. The men went into hiding. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy for that whole region and for the whole Highland way of life, really. It was so bad for the Highlanders that they even had something called the Dress Act that was passed by George II when the Battle of Culloden was over. It actually forbade the wearing of any tartan, any plaid, any Highland dress at all. It was considered a sign of rebellion. And the Highlanders, for the most part, ignored this. But that just shows you how intense this was, this fight back and forth. It was repealed in 1782, but it was still a law. And it was very, very dangerous to be a Jacobite during those times. So there you have a little bit of the history of the period. And now we can take a closer look at my little Bonnie Prince Charlie. So I was just fascinated by all the different things on this little guy. And the more I looked, the more I saw. So first of all, he came in a wooden box, and there were all sorts of things with him that had been with him from the very beginning. And the first thing I noticed was this. This is his dirk. A dirk was a traditional Jacobite knife. It was often made from the remnant of a larger size sword. And here you have a picture of a regular sized dirk. The handles were often adorned with quite some embellishment, and they typically had what was called a cairngorm stone in them. Cairngorm was a type of quartz that was mined from the mountains that were on the eastern part of Scotland, and it was a yellowish colored quartz. Well, look here. My Prince Charlie's dirk was just like the ones that were carried by the Jacobites, and his handle is also embellished with the cairngorm stone. But it gets better. This is a picture of the real big size Prince Charlie's brooch. It was a famous brooch. It was auctioned in London in 2012, and it brought in £750,000. You can see it has a central section that was yellow. This happened to be a diamond. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 circular petals around with white diamonds. Well, take a look at Charlie's handle. It has the center yellow stone, in this case it's cairngorm stone, and 8 petals around it, just like the brooch. And you can see there is one little clear stone left from the originals. I mean, I suppose I could replace the others. I don't know. I can't decide if I should do that or not. But anyway, here's the original one, so you could see it's the same, yellow, and then the white stones all around. So I thought that was just so exciting. I mean, when I first saw this knife, I'm like, oh, he has a little knife. Big deal, right? But this is validation that was really genuinely dressed as Bonnie Prince Charlie. And that brings me to why it's so important. Well, I'll just put that there. Oops, we're gonna have things falling. Why that is so important? I believe that this doll had to have been owned by a Jacobite family. No one else would have known all these details. And also, the other thing is that it had to have been a very prominent Jacobite family. Maybe this doll was even owned by the daughter of a laird of one of the clans. These types of dolls were not very common. Only very wealthy children would have had a beautiful carved English wooden doll such as this. Most children didn't have dolls at all, and if they did, maybe they would be made out of a corn husk or rags or something like that. But a very well-to-do child might have had a doll such as this. So let's keep going. The little sword fell down, and that was exactly what I was going to talk about next. This is my doll, Bonnie Prince Charlie's sword. This sword is just like the swords that were used in the Jacobite Rebellion by the Jacobites. You can see here a picture of the type of swords that were used. This is a full-size sword. These swords had what was called a basket hilt. The hilt is the handle of the sword. This hilt had been predecessed by a different type of hilt, which was called the claymore sword. The claymore hilt was solid metal. You can imagine how heavy that would be to lift and how hard it would be to maneuver it around. So then they invented, after the claymore sword came the basket-hilted sword, where they basically cut out about at least half of the metal and had this basket-type woven shape, and that made the sword half as heavy and easier to use. The Jacobite sword were also always lined with red, either red flannel or wool or velvet, and they often had a red tassel. You can see the little tassel here. And we know for a fact that Prince Charlie's basket-hilted sword was also lined in red. In fact, I saw a photograph of a little fragment of his, supposedly that was the lining of the basket hilt on his own sword. And what do we have here? Well, we don't have any lining left over, but we certainly have a little red tassel, and we have a basket-hilted sword. Again, I mean, I just saw this and I thought, oh, he has a sword. So what? Well, the detail. It's the detail. And then let's keep going. He has Royal Stewart tartan plaid stockings. Albeit they're quite faded, but that is Royal Stewart tartan. This is Royal Stewart tartan as well. There are many, many, many tartans. I have this book here. It's called The Scottish Clans and Their Tartans. So many tartans, so many tartans. There could have been any number of tartans on his stockings, right? Or why would he even have plaid stockings at all? That's pretty uncommon, right? He has the Royal Stewart tartan on his stockings. And that brings me to, again, about this, about tartans. As I mentioned, they had this act called the Dress Act following Culloden in 1746, and that forbade the wearing of tartan. The Royal Stewart tartan used to be only allowed to be worn by royalty. Now that has since gone by the wayside because of commercialization. I mean, I was able to get this like on Etsy, online or something. So it was impossible to maintain that. But there is actually a tartan today that is only allowed to be worn by royalty, and that's the Balmoral tartan. You have to either be royalty or have permission from the Queen to wear the Balmoral tartan. So let's move on. I wanted to point out something else relating to the dirk, to the little sword knife, and that is that only very recently I thought, these flowers, they are very beautiful. They're little tiny glass beads and very intricate beadwork and embroidery here. But look at these two right here in front and center. Look at the shape and the size. A center circular shape, and how many petals? 8. Now, some of the other flowers have different numbers, but I thought that was pretty interesting that we've got right here front and center, again, that same symbol, that same personal symbol of Prince Charlie, this daisy-shaped flower with 8 petals. So then we come to his pocket watch. We know that both his grandfather and his father and Charlie had close allies in the French. Here we have his pocket watch. We know that he was gifted. Charlie was gifted a pocket watch by the French, his allies. And here we have the fleur-de-lis, symbol of France. So that's pretty nifty too. And then it gets even better. Look over here. Amongst all this detail, you see his badge, his medallion. And this is just like the one that Prince Charlie wore. And it has in its center a red X. That was the Jacobite symbol. It was their emblem. It was their standard. It was on the flags that they carried to battle at Culloden. This is a close-up of the badge, so you can see a little better. And this is the Jacobite symbol, the X. And not to mention the fact that he has pale blonde hair and light eyes. And, you know, I just got shivers every time I would discover something else about him that confirmed that his connection to Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite history, it just was exhilarating for me. And again, I just learned so much through him. I didn't know any of these details until I started researching the parts and pieces of this doll. So now I'd love to share with you some of the accessories and things that I have with Charlie, because that makes it all the more fun, right? I always try to set out my dolls in scenes, and I always like to have with them, especially when it's a historical doll like this, things that have to do with them. So I mentioned that Bonnie Prince Charlie was the stuff of lore, of legend. So there were many books written about him. There were songs written about him. Here you have a whole little book of Scottish songs, and here we have one called Bonnie Prince Charlie. You may have heard, there's quite a famous song called The Sky, the song, and because Bonnie Prince Charlie himself escaped. He is from after the Battle of Culloden. He went into hiding, and then he escaped on a boat, disguised in the clothing of a woman, to the Isle of Skye. So there's a beautiful song all about that, and then he subsequently went to France. Once he found a safe little opening to get out. We have here some antique maps. I have lots of sub collections, as I've mentioned, and I'm going to scoot over here. This is not, one of my sub-collections is miniature antique maps. I love to show them, display them with my dolls. Now, this is not a miniature map, but I thought it was just so fascinating. This is here I'm gonna get my glasses so I can read it accurately to you. This is a map of the counties adjacent to Carlisle, showing, which is spelled with an E, I love to see the old English spelling, the route of the rebels. Okay, so this clearly was an English map because they're calling them the rebels. And you see all the various moors and Carlisle Castle, which again was the very first victory of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobites when they besieged the castle and took it over, and all the munitions inside, in fact, for their fort. And right down here, it's very hard to read, but it says B, Young Pretender Approach. So this is apparently where he approached himself, Bonnie Prince Charlie. So I have that hanging up with him. And then we have some other truly miniature maps. These predate Charlie by quite a lot. These are from the 1500s. But this is an ancient map of Scotland that he likes to look at. I love how they oftentimes had boats in the ocean on these ancient maps. And this is an ancient map of England. Again, little boats. I just find them fascinating, and also to compare the shapes of the countries to the real thing. They didn't always get it right, believe me. And then we have some miniature portraits. This is Bonnie Prince Charlie. You can see the likeness. Do you see it? This likeness. Here, I'm going to hold it up right next to him so you can really see closely. There. I think it's quite a likeness. He even has a black ribbon in his ponytail, just like the guy in the portrait. just like Charlie in the portrait. Here's another portrait of Bonnie Prince Charlie. This is in black and white, and another. And this is very interesting. This is a portrait of James III, the Old Pretender. He as a young boy, you can see here, or James II. Sorry, I get them mixed up every once in a while. This is actually what's called plumbago. Plumbago was done with graphite and often on vellum. And this was very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. And this is James as a very young prince. So I thought that was very, very special to add to his collection of things. And here is a picture, not a picture, this is what's called a money weight. And this was from James I. James I had a tremendous desire to unite the kingdoms of England and Scotland, and that didn't happen. And he called this the James Unite. And money was weighed in those days. And they say worth its weight in gold. Money was actually weighed. So here we have this side. And then on the other side, you have later the countermark of Charles, who succeeded him in the throne after James died. So that's another little souvenir and a token that Charlie has. And then here we have this little disc. This is James II and a picture of him, and you can see it says abdicated December 1688. So this was clearly an English piece. This was a piece that was part of what they call a coronation set. It's a little round tin, and inside they were often done to celebrate various monarchs' coronations. And inside are these little paper discs of all the monarchs leading up to the monarch that was being crowned. And so this was clearly an English item because they said he abdicated. He didn't really abdicate. He fled for his life. He was deposed. He could not stay. I thought that was very interesting. And then these pieces here are Jacobite jewelry. So they're both in honor of James III, the Old Pretender. This one is what they call a mourning slide. A ribbon, a velvet or a silk ribbon, would be run through those two pieces, and it would be worn as a choker. And this is unusual because Jacobite jewelry was often very clandestine. So this might have been worn as a choker or a bracelet underneath a piece of clothing, because you never ever wanted to advertise that you were Jacobite. It was considered treason. It was very dangerous. This is a tiny, tiny little button, and you can barely see, but inside is the insignia also of James III. Tiny, tiny little insignia inside. It's a button, a hidden little thing. And I've seen pictures of miniature boxes with little hidden compartments that'll have a portrait of Bonnie Prince Charlie or his dad. And it was a very, very hidden little secret, because again, they couldn't be advertised because it was dangerous. And then I have these pieces here. Now this is called Tartan Wear. This is just a little book about Prince Charlie. Put that back. This is called Tartan Wear. This is much later than the doll, but I thought it looked charming with him. Tartan Wear were these little boxes. They were souvenir ware made in Scotland, and they typically had different tartans on them. So this one is Prince Charlie, tartan here, and then there's all different ones. They were often used as little sewing trinkets. So like this one is a thimble holder. And lots of doll collectors use these pieces with their dolls because, well, you know, lots of doll collectors like sewing items because they were so delicate and tiny and they're fun, and they just work well with our dolls. They look like little boxes. They look like little, this is a little tiny brush. They just look like little odds and ends that you can show, a little trunk with your dolls. And just because they have the tartan, I thought they'd look charming with Charlie. Now here, this is an actual newspaper, and this is very interesting. This is an actual newspaper, a British newspaper, and this was published on the 17th of August in 1715, and it talks about lots of turmoil happening between the Catholics and the Protestants at that time. And it's very interesting because only 6 days later, on the 23rd of August, was the date of the first Jacobite rebellion, the 23rd of August, 1715. So that's a rather interesting piece to keep with him. And then moving along here is this trunk. So I'm always looking for beautiful early trunks for my dolls. And when I saw this, I was very, very interested in acquiring it just because it was a beautiful early trunk. And then I found out that inside the contents were supposedly items that had belonged to Prince Charlie when he was a baby. Now, is this really true? Well, let's look. So first of all, you do have this one little hint, the fleur-de-lis. We understand the close connection between Prince Charlie and his whole family and France, right? So this might have even been a gift from France when the baby was born. He was born in Rome. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. I think I did. So you look inside, and this is what I found. So there's this very ancient piece of parchment, and on it, in very old lettering, it says, "This baby linen of Prince Charles Edward Stewart is an heirloom from the Fergusons of Inverclyde." And it has a list. It says 2 shirts, 4 caps, 4 pair of baby's mittens, 6 specimens of baby's lace, and 3 models of infant's robes, doll size. So that's rather interesting. And on the other side, you have the family tree of this family, of the Ferguson family of Inverclyde. And it starts way back in the 1400s and then goes all the way through 1867. And I was really so excited that I might find someone who had died at Culloden. I thought that would have been really cool. But I didn't find anyone who died at Culloden. So they were lucky. They were very lucky. But anyway, we have this. Certainly they were a Jacobite family, or why would they have kept Prince Charlie's linens? So if you look inside, we see this little piece, which is, I'm not sure if it was a button or a thread holder, or maybe if it's supposed to unscrew and be a little box. I'm not sure. That is somewhat of a mystery. If anybody has any ideas out there, please share with me. But it has a little crown on it. And here are 2 of the pair of baby mittens. These are baby mittens to keep their hands warm. They let their little fingers go out. But the thumbs were covered up sometimes and sometimes not. We have the caps. We have some other things, odds and ends. Sadly, the shirts are nowhere to be found. They're not there. But then this was also in the trunk. So it says, first of all, here we have the other 2. They said there were 4 pair of baby's mittens. So here's the 3rd and here's the 4th. Here's the 4th pair of baby's mittens. And then this is fantastic. Baby lace of Prince Charles the Pretender. So this is the most fine lace I've ever seen in my life. Look at that. Do you see? There's like little animals woven into it and a crown. And here also, this has a letter, some word written, and I can't make it out. I'm going to have to work on that. There's actually a word, I believe, written there, and I haven't been able to make it out. Here is some more lace, and here we have the crowns, just like the crown on this piece. It's the same crown, same with this little center medallion. See that? And this is some of the finest lace I've ever seen. I mean, it's really, really amazing. And then models of dolls' clothes, caps, sleeves, and stays. Not sure why the dolls' clothes were there, but kind of cool, right? Because I'm a doll collector. So that was just a wonderful treasure. And then I just brought these to share. These are also baby mittens. These are actually medieval period. So they're very interesting how they had such special things for their babies, little lace mittens for their hands. Only a very, very special baby would have had those. Let's see, did I talk about everything? Oh, well, I wanted to finish with this. So, the Battle of Culloden. Do you know, if you go today to Culloden Moor, you will see this marker. And then you will see many markers of all the clans who lost terrible, terrible numbers of lives on that terrible day. Not only was the Battle of Culloden a horrible, horrible battle with lots of loss of life, it marked the ends of the hopes and dreams of the Jacobites forever. There would never, ever again be an attempt to restore the Stewart monarch to the throne, to restore Catholicism to England. It was over with this battle. If you go today, there are flowers everywhere. You can't see them that well. They're a little bit cut off in this photo, but there are flowers strewn everywhere, any day of the week, anytime. Many, many, many people have relatives that they trace their ancestry to, and this whole period of history. When Bonnie Prince Charlie died in 1788, and then subsequently his younger brother Prince Harry in 1801, the male Stewart line was over. It had existed since the 1200s, and it was over. It did continue through the female line to Queen Victoria and the present royal family, who I mentioned wear the Balmoral tartan. But for everyone else, it was over. So I learned so much about this period of history, and it's really such a sad and tragic and poignant piece of history, and all through this special little doll.